Hello, this is Mike Knezovich, and welcome to the latest edition of Tune Up with Mike and Monty, Brain Science Step by Step. Every week we discuss how the brain works and sometimes how it doesn't work the way we want it to. I'm here with Dr. Monty Pavuluri. How are you today, Doctor?
I'm great, Mike, and hello, everyone. It's fun to be doing this week. We don't do every week, right?
No, we
Once in
don't
a
do
while.
every week, but this one we're doing a little more quickly after the last one because we started last week talking about perspective taking, the ability to sort of see what others see or understand what others understand from their point of view. And it's an important enough topic and complicated enough that we thought we would sort of take it up again to refine some of the things we began talking about last week. For example, I think in my mind and last week I spoke about empathy and perspective taking as if they are interchangeable. And although they might be related, they really aren't the same thing.
Right. I still think, Mike, that they're somehow related very closely. However, it's really important to differentiate the finer aspects of multiple terms related to perspective taking. We might as well do that up front.
Yeah.
Perspective taking, for example, is a process of temporarily suspending or stopping how one would think from one's own point of view and then view it from the situation as someone else might think or understand. And usually, we use several strategies when you're doing perspective taking, such as you imagine oneself in that other person's place, or we would have had similar experiences in the past, or we apply general knowledge and then pull it together cognitively. And it could be visually understanding what they could have seen by physically changing our location, or it could be understanding mentally what other person might be thinking. And it doesn't really need any compassion or emotional identification with the other person.
So it's more of a cognitive or intellectual exercise.
Yeah, it's just basically understanding what you are thinking about the certain aspect and different angles. For example, in business, you think that you're negotiating things, then you think about what your perspective is on what you're trying to sell and why you're selling that way. So it is useful in business. When it comes to empathy, it's a capacity to understand and feel what another person is experiencing and within their frame of reference. So it's actually the capacity to emotionally place oneself in another's position.
So the basic difference is it's emotionally focused.
Yeah, it has it encompasses several emotional states. And you can also, of course, say, Mike, that it could be like, it could be divided into, say, cognitive empathy, where you think about what others might be thinking and feeling. And emotional empathy is the affective state when they're thinking about someone else. And somatic empathy is where others might try and feel what it would be like physically for you through their feelings. So, to expand on empathy, say compassion and sympathy are somewhat associated with it. Like it's an empathic concern, right? Compassion is something that you would worry about what others are thinking and feeling, but with an attitude to help. Whereas sympathy would be something like you are concerned about someone else. You have an empathic concern, not necessarily trying to help. So compassion may be a little superior to sympathy in some way, but compassion is not always required, and sympathy is where it ends. Sometimes they're all good terms, but they're related to one another, and with empathy. So perspective taking is different from empathy.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. What is going on? What do we know about what's going on in the brain? What is the theory of the mind in terms of what's going on sort of physiologically,
Yeah.
the sort of brain science part of it.
Right. So first, I want to help everyone understand what theory of mind is. Though it is different than perspective taking. However, Mike, I mean, it's completely different. It's sort of related, but different from perspective taking, and to some extent, and a large extent, empathy. Theory of mind is a innate ability of a person to understand others' experience, and it's related to empathy, of course, though. But the meaning and recognition and understanding of states of minds of others, including their beliefs, desires, and particularly emotions, is important here. And for example, theory of mind is explained through an example much better. Say, for example, if you have a box of chocolates. When I was little, I used to put a lot of pencils in the chocolate box and take to school.
Uh-huh.
So, and somebody might mistake it for, oh, you got chocolates to school, and then when you open it, there are pencils. So someone else might ask me what Sam would think if he sees this box. I would say, if I say pencils, then I don't have the ability or theory of mind to understand the false belief that is being held. So when I say, oh, Sam would think it's chocolates, because he would have a false belief because it's a chocolate box.
Yeah.
You
could reasonably
understand. He could reasonably understand.
Yeah.
What others would think if you see something common. Common things are common, we say, right?
Right.
So when you are stuck with what you just learned as a false thing, and think that others would have also that false belief, is where there's deficit of theory of mind.
Okay.
So that's when the people with children or adults with autism have major deficit. 80% of people with autism have deficit in theory of mind. Whereas people with even Down syndrome, that is with intellectual disability, and people without autism don't have the deficit in theory of mind.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So that is the ability to switch and understand other people's mind and hold the false belief is different than actually perspective taking in a broader sense, or empathy, that is emotional concern for someone else. So they're kind of like intricately connected themes.
Yes.
But they're all three are different.
No, they are subtly different, but kind of different in important ways in terms of when you're understanding. That's really interesting about the Down syndrome people and people that, and it also tells you something about how important that is in our daily lives.
Right. And another personal example I have, just to make it clear, about perspective taking. Okay, this is like culturally also interesting. When my husband, who's the son-in-law, goes to my mother's house, my mom would lovingly feed him food. Okay, and the dinner, lunch, whenever he comes, it's a big feast, and she insists that he eats, and of course she empathically prepares all the things he likes, but he can only eat so much, and so she keeps putting more and more on his plate. So my mom is empathic, but she lacks perspective taking
right.
of my husband, who's not eating so much, especially at this age.
Right.
So,
I think that's an example lots and lots of us could.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, right? But that's kind of an easy way to understand.
Yeah.
Another thing, I used to say when I sort of shared a sad story to a friend. Some people kind of are very empathic and express concern and understand the perspective of my experience as well. And then they might be very compassionate and offer me solutions. Okay? Whereas some people might be very sympathetic and feel sorry. Or some people might really start crying and deep into their personal distress because they are so moved by my story. That I'm sharing.
They're feeling the same things you're feeling.
But that's not like they're empathic, but then that empathy is very different from the personal distress they're feeling. Like they're bringing their own personal pathology in some way. Not pathology, but experience is a little over the top.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like a gradual and multiple ways of how people respond. So when you take a perspective, it's just basically understanding other people's feelings, whereas empathy is a little different, you know? So that's what I wanted to clarify. So when you take a perspective taking, you asked at the outset, what's the neurobiology? Because we are on the topic of perspective taking, I would really like to just kind of summarize some of the brain workings behind perspective taking, which is now cognitive understanding from various angles of what other person might be thinking, or visual or thinking level, okay? So last time we talked a little bit about first person perspective versus third person perspective, what it would mean for you, okay? So it's almost like when you are not thinking about empathy here, but just the perspective taking, okay? And that's when you actually see the mentalizing network in action. You're mentally considering what other person is thinking. And what is fascinating is there's a network behind this mentalizing process in perspective taking, where there's meta-analysis done and ton of studies showed very similar findings. So I can't quote a single study for it, for example, but it's just, trust me, it's just a cohesive understanding. It's basically a medial prefrontal cortex is activated when you're mentalizing, and there is also when the network consists of superior temporal sulcus, that is the lateral part of the brain on the side at the back, dorsal and posterior. So on the top and at the back of the side, if you can understand. That's the superior temporal sulcus, and where it meets the parietal cortex, where the cones of our brain are. So that's temporoparietal junction. So all that side part of the brain is involved, the dorsal part, when you're remembering the cold facts, okay, from experience, what happens in this situation, why you would be thinking that way, those kinds of cold facts based on the world's experiences. And then the heart perspective, or understanding others' thinking perspective, is when medial prefrontal cortex is involved. That's like the medial part of the front of the brain. That's all where when you think about other people.
Okay.
Here and now.
So that back part is kind of like the memory bank.
The side to the back.
Sides of the back. Yeah.
So there is a cold perspective and the hot perspective together sometimes come together when you're making a perspective taking. Okay? And
so how does all right, so we're not, a baby can't do this stuff.
Right,
right?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, a baby can't do a lot of stuff. But what I mean is, when and how do we acquire in our development these abilities?
Right. So just like how we talked about brain development in the last episode, in this episode, I'd like to just underscore in a very simple way that, for example, 3 or 4 processes are interlinked in brain development towards perspective taking.
Okay.
One is impulse control, where you're trying to suppress your impulse to act while you're thinking about others' thinking, because you're not so egocentric and you want to suppress your way of thinking towards other person's perspective. That's when prefrontal cortex is involved.
Okay, so that keep the impulse is, I want something and I want it right now, but
or I think this way.
I think this way.
But
okay.
I want to think the other person's way.
Okay.
So that requires some impulse control. And then there is face emotion recognition, when you think about other people, what they're thinking, and get the cues from their face. And that is where you use superior temporal sulcus, the side of the brain.
Okay.
And then you also understand emotions of the other person. So amygdala is somewhat involved. So there is the perspective taking integrated with impulse control and facial emotion recognition. All of it develop over time in teenage as these brain parts are developing and networking together in understanding it. what is also fascinating is parietal lobe also develops in teenage, and the motor, visuospatial, conceptual, emotional understanding is developed with parietal lobe, where where you imitate other people, right? Or how they sit, how they kind of cross their legs, and you end up mirroring other people's actions and integrate them into your
You
own
adopt them as your
repertoire,
own.
adopt,
Yeah.
and that is where the parietal lobe is involved. So all these little aspects of the brain come together: the front, side, back, bottom. All these parts form this mentalizing.
And is this during adolescence?
Throughout the adulthood, but acutely so in adolescence.
All right.
And also we differentiate self from others through this inferior parietal lobe structure, which is also a very important area that just kind of helps you to find how you are different from other people, and also anticipating others' mental state, what others are likely to think. The anticipation is also is present from the medial prefrontal cortex, like we were talking about at the mentalizing. So there is that front part of the brain, side part of the brain, back of the brain. All of these kind of work together, doing various aspects, and it's almost like an orchestra that comes together.
That's amazing, really. But it's also it kind of explains some teenage behavior too, like that they're lacking these basic things explains a lot, and it would I think it helps me sort of tolerate it better, understanding that it's really not like an intentional thing, that they just don't have these abilities yet.
That's right. I mean, thinking about it, Mike, there's so much we can learn by just not even with, just knowing that the brain is developing, knowing that it's not all done yet, and that these kids are finagling with it.
Yeah.
While you're constantly teaching them how others might be thinking. For example, thinking about perspective taking, you can teach them to some extent, although a lot of it is innate.
Right.
You can also teach as they develop. You can teach them about different characters in a storybook, how the others may be thinking. There is another person's perspective. Say, for example, a kid is not really settling down in classroom. It's very important for that child to also, or teen, to also understand or learn to develop an understanding of how difficult it is for the teacher to cope. And you always think about adults having to cope with the teens, but we don't think the other way around.
Yeah, right.
Partly because the kids are still developing, the teenagers are still developing. But that said, we could teach them in our daily work or with our own children how different people may be thinking differently. Different characters have their own mind. What could you think in their shoes? What could they be thinking? How could that be hard? That's where empathy meets perspective taking.
Yeah. Okay, so we had touched on this in the last episode, and briefly even today. The thing about people with autism lack this ability, even though other people with developmental disabilities don't.
Sorry.
That's all right. Can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of what's going on in the brain that someone might lack this ability?
We are, like, say, for example, the most prominent example is autism, for example. So they might have deficit in perspective taking, and as well as theory of mind aspects. It's hard to kind of like separate all of these concepts exactly and precisely. But what happens in autism is that the connection within the cortex, cortico-cortical, in other words, the intricate connections within the cortex, like temporal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and parietal lobe, all of those is somewhat compromised.
Okay.
And subcortico-cortical connections, that is from the areas below the cortex, are connected more strongly to individual areas of the cortex much more strongly. So there is a compensatory, perhaps, development, or it could be due to innate difficulties and the way they're born, or it could be experiential difficulties that create different kinds of wiring
Okay.
in these kids. We don't know. So it could be experiential or compensatory or innate, but this connectivity is different in autism in a way. And also, there are deficits in prefrontal cortex with, for example, inferior parietal lobe could show decreased activation, whereas right inferior frontal gyrus, that's the bottom of the brain, that's responsible for impulsivity, emotion control, and some of the memory holding. All of those functions are done in IFG. In terms of its connectivity to other parts of the brain, and that inferior frontal gyrus is active and trying harder to gain emotional control and get perspective taking going in autism. And there is also what is called mirror neuron system, where you code what is observed first, visually. You see what is going on around you,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And then you understand the emotions around that aspect that you observe, and you imitate, okay? So usually, the people with autism do prefer and favor biological stimuli, non-biological stimuli like houses. For example, in fMRI machine, if you stick them and you want them to remember certain things or point to certain things, and with the task involving a home, it's easier for them, and then they avert their gaze from the faces
Okay.
when they're severely
Okay.
ill. So, I mean, that deficit is due to perhaps fusiform gyrus area, the area on the side of the brain that is involved in recognizing facial emotions and grasping the thoughts behind what could be going on. So that deficit in fusiform area in particular is also responsible for some of the deficits in appreciating biological stimuli such as faces, and that's when this mirror neuron network cannot function as efficiently in these kids with autism, where there is imitation learning and stuff, and they fall apart.
Yeah.
And they end up averting their gaze from people and not being able to have social skills developed through this imitation process, understanding, capturing, and assimilating the social skills through development.
Because I think the common understanding about autism is that they have difficulty in social situations, and this explains it. I mean, it doesn't explain the cause of it, but I never understood that what's not happening in the brain to make this difficult. They just don't even have the capacity because of this difference in development levels and stuff at different parts of the brain.
Totally. Yeah. And so it's an ongoing process. And yeah, I mean, if you understand some aspects that are related but not exactly the same, like theory of mind, by 3 and 4, you could start to actually develop the false belief system and all of that. That's deficient in autism. So you could actually diagnose now with some of this deficits very early on.
Uh-huh.
I'm not really going into theory of mind right now, but if you think about joint attention, when the mothers spend a lot of time with the children and try to gain their eye gaze and who, and when the kids start to understand that you are special and you're related to them in showing that affection, there are these processes that come into place with joint attention that could develop a sense of other early on, and that could help in perspective taking, it could help in theory of mind, it could help in empathy, it could help a number of things with the jointness and connectedness and helping them understand
that's
very
why
early on.
An early diagnosis is so important, because you probably can make some difference with these various approaches and therapies.
Well, you never stop trying, right, Mike?
No, I mean, regardless of when, but Okay, well, I think we've run up on our time, and I think we've wrapped up this topic.
Yeah, it's been interesting how to think about perspective taking, how it differs from empathy and theory of mind, and how the brain works within perspective taking, and that it develops in teenage. All of these are fascinating concepts that you don't really think naturally day to day
No.
in your working, but as often, as intense as I am involved in taking care of children with problems, I mean, we could use these tools much, much, much more in actively teaching them, helping them understand, and develop a wider thought process.
Yes.